All right, so let's take a few seconds and read the sentence on the screen. Now, please raise your hand if English is not your first language. Cool, that's a lot of people. So for those of you who raised their hand, it turns out that it's possible to predict what is your first language only from the way that your eyes were moving while you were reading that sentence in English. So this is a rather surprising outcome, and as we'll see, it is possible to do that because language learners have a special pair of glasses through which they read and comprehend other languages. This is related to a more general topic in linguistics, which is called cross-linguistic transfer. And it's easiest to illustrate this in language production. So let's take a look at a concrete example. These are a few sentences from an ESL essay, that is English as second language essay, that were written by a native speaker of Russian. Let's read out the first sentence. In your ad was said that in main role would be Danny Brooke. Sounds weird, right? So if you look at this sentence, and in fact the remaining sentences in this example, this is not what you would call proper English. But if we take these sentences and direct translate them word by word into Russian, they sound perfect. So well done there. And this exemplifies this process of cross-linguistic influence where structure and lexicon of the first language is applied in the context of a newly learned foreign language. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with this, either firsthand or by interacting with English learners. So we know quite a bit about cross-linguistic influence in language production, both in writing and in speech, but surprisingly little about the role of the first language in second language comprehension. And this will be the focus of our work, where we'll propose eye tracking while reading free-form second language text as a framework for studying cross-linguistic transfer in second language comprehension. Here is our experiment. You start by looking at a fixation point for 300 milliseconds. That triggers a sentence. You read that sentence. When you're done reading, you press a button. Then you look at the letter Q for 300 milliseconds. That in turn triggers a question about the sentence that you just read. You answer the question with a yes or a no, and we'll let you know if you answered correctly. So you do this 156 times, and then you're done. So it's a pretty boring experiment. The whole experiment is 156 sentences, and all these sentences are taken from the Wall Street Journal. So we have 4 different native languages: Chinese, Japanese, Portuguese, and Spanish, and 36 to 37 participants for each language. The sentences are divided into 2 groups. The first group is what we call the shared sentences, where all the participants are reading the exact same set of sentences. And then the remaining half of the sentences are individual sentences, where different participants read different sentences. Let's start with the shared regime, where everybody is reading the same set of sentences. Now, what we want here is a simple, interpretable, and most importantly, robust set of features that will characterize the way that people are scanning these sentences. We'll start by segmenting the sentence into interest regions which span individual words, and then we'll look at the fraction of time that you spend on each word. More concretely, we're going to look at 3 fixation metrics: total fixation duration, first pass fixation duration, and first fixation duration. And then the word feature will be this fixation time normalized by the fixation metric per word within the sentence. So in this setup where everybody is reading the same sentences, it just amounts to the fraction of time that you spend on each word. Now, what this normalization gives us is invariance to the reading speed of the participants. Now we can take our features and feed them into a linear classifier, and let's see how well this performs. So first of all, in red, we have our majority baseline, which is slightly above 25%. And here we see that our fixation feature sets perform really well, well above this baseline. We can get further improvements to this performance by considering not only single words, but also spans of bigrams, as well as spans of trigrams. So what this result tells us is that there is a strong first language signal in second language reading. All right, so far we've been looking at the shared regime where everybody were reading the same sentences. This is a very powerful setup because it lets us completely normalize over the reading input of the participants, so the words appear in fixed context, and it lets the classifier focus only on the differences between different readers. However, this setup also has a major limitation, and the limitation is that we are constrained to this specific set of 78 sentences. So we want to generalize from this setup and now have participants read arbitrary sentences. So we want to use arbitrary sentences both in training and in testing. And this is the purpose of the individual sentences regime, where we have different people read different sentences. So this is clearly a much more challenging setup because the reading materials of participants are no longer comparable. So let's see how we address that. First of all, we're going to normalize fixation features globally. So now we divide the fixation metric by the fixation metric per word across all the sentences that the participant is reading. Then we're going to cluster words by some predefined linguistic criteria. And finally, to extract the feature set, we'll average the fixation times within each cluster. So which clustering criteria should we use? The first proposal is to use word length. So word length is an interesting clustering criteria because it approximates average information content. So this is the average predictability of a word across different contexts. So now we can substitute our lexical items with their length and use this as features. So the feature will be the average fixation time of words of length 2, 3, and so forth. Another clustering criteria is syntactic clusters. So as I mentioned before, we're using the Wall Street Journal, which comes with annotations for part-of-speech tags and syntax trees. So what we can do here is substitute words with their respective part-of-speech tags or with their syntactic function, which is the label to the head word. Now let's see how these clustering perform. So in red, again, we have our majority baseline. It turns out that if you cluster words randomly, you get a result that is very close to this majority baseline. On the other hand, our information clusters substantially outperform these baselines. You can get better results with the syntactic clusters, and the best results are obtained by combining these two information sources. So this is cool because it lets us generalize this task of native language identification in reading to completely arbitrary sentences. All right, so we've seen that it works, and now we want to understand a little bit better why it works. So what is the signal that enables us to classify the reader's first language? So we'll start by measuring similarities between languages with respect to how native speakers of these languages are reading in English. For that, we'll take our classifier and look at its confusion metrics. So the more uncertain is the classifier with respect to a pair of languages, the more similar they are. We're going to compare the similarities to the linguistic similarities between our languages, which we'll extract from the URL database. So this database has both typological and genealogical features about our languages. In order to obtain the similarity between a pair of languages, we'll take the cosine similarity of their feature vectors. Now we can compare these two independently derived similarity metrics to one another. So on the x-axis, we have the linguistically based similarities. On the y-axis, we have the reading-based similarities. And we can see that these two similarity metrics correlate with one another. We can further take these pairwise similarities as input to a hierarchical clustering algorithm. So on the left, you have the resulting linguistic tree. On the right, you have the ESL reading tree, which essentially reconstructs the linguistic tree. Now, what is cool to bear in mind is that the tree on the right was obtained without access to any knowledge about these languages, so we got it only from eye movement while reading in a second language, which is pretty cool, I think. All right, now we want to look at more specific features that are distinctive for different native languages. And we're going to start with the case of determiners. So here we have our 4 native languages: Chinese, Japanese, Portuguese, and Spanish. And as an additional baseline, we have native speakers of English. So what we see here is that native speakers of Chinese and Japanese, which are languages that don't have determiners, spend less time on determiners compared to native speakers of English, as well as compared to native speakers of Portuguese and Spanish. You can also see that Portuguese and Spanish don't differ from English in that respect. So what this suggests is that, at least in some cases, when you don't have a certain structural property in your native language, you may be spending less time on it when you're reading in a second language. And we see a similar pattern for pronouns, where, again, Chinese and Japanese are pro-drop languages, and they spend less time on pronouns compared to native speakers of English. And to some extent, you can also see this in Portuguese and Spanish, which also allow drop-in pronouns in some contexts. Here's another interesting case, nouns. So here we see the opposite. Chinese and Japanese spend more time on nouns compared to native speakers of English and also compared to Portuguese and Spanish. So one possible explanation for that is that Chinese and Japanese share much less lexicon with English compared to Portuguese and Spanish. So if you take these three examples together, determiners, pronouns, nouns, you can see that there are both structural as well as lexical factors that could be driving the reading times that we observe in a second language. All right, so to summarize, we've seen that it's possible to predict the first language of a reader only from their eye movement. And we've also seen that differences in reading are very likely to be related to linguistic factors. So first of all, ESL reading preserves global similarities between languages. And secondly, distinctive features reflect properties of the native language and the way that they relate to equivalent properties of English. Taken together, this gives us evidence for a systematic cross-linguistic transfer in second language reading and by extension in second language comprehension. We have several directions for future work. So first of all, we want to compare the kind of results that we obtained here with similar tasks in language production. So this will be native language identification from text and related feature analysis. We also want to do eye tracking, and in particular eye tracking with free-form text as a kind of general framework for studying second language acquisition. And finally, we want to integrate data and features in eye tracking with text-based NLP. So we think there is a lot to explore there, and it could be very beneficial for both domains. And with that, I'll end my talk.
Okay, questions? Microphone, please.
So cross-linguistic influences, I know as a theory that has been proposed for influences that come both from the native language of a speaker towards the second language and vice versa. Is there any possibility to follow whether bilinguals have different eye tracking movements compared to simple native speakers that don't speak other languages?
That's a great question. We don't have enough data for bilinguals to test that. I think it would be also possible to test whether the other direction, if you can detect your first language, the signal will be much weaker, I guess, but I think it's a very interesting question for future research.
And how much bias do you think you get from errors of eye tracking movements? I mean, the device itself that...
I spent like half a year figuring out how to calibrate it correctly, so hopefully it works okay now.
I just want to add a comment. Oh, okay. I really like your research. It's really interesting, and I have a couple of questions. So first of all, why did you pick these 4 languages?
I live in Boston, and it's just easiest to find participants from these languages. We're now collecting data for additional languages, okay. Arabic in particular. Okay. But it's just, these are languages that are widely spoken, and there are communities in Boston of immigrants and people that come from these countries, so it's easier to find participants. So it's mostly a practical reason. But also, we wanted to have a set of typologically diverse languages. So we didn't want too many languages that are very similar to each other.
Okay. So second question is, I know different people have different level of, how good their English is. Let's say different Chinese people can speak different level of English. So how did you pick the participants? Let's say, did you pick them with different levels, or?
Yeah.
I don't know.
So most of the participants are in intermediate to advanced proficiency in English, and
so they've all studied in America.
Not all of them.
Okay.
As in, they all live in America, but many of them studied English in their home country and then came to the U.S.
Okay, so they're pretty good at English, basically.
So it varies within groups, but we control for that across groups. So on average, each native language has the same English proficiency.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi. Trying to take myself up. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I have a question. It seems that the way non-native speakers read actually reinforce their struggle with their L1 knowledge. Do you think that an intervention that would show them word by word and would force them to look at the things they tend to spend less time on because it doesn't exist in the language would actually help them to learn the language better? Would you think that you can design something that would put the input in two different ways and would see if it has an effect on their learning?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if that would work, but in principle, we're just used to reading text in a certain way because it was printed on paper, and now that we read on electronic screens, we can manipulate text, we can manipulate how you present it, and how it looks like. I mean, a lot of parameters. From what I know, it's a pretty open domain, and there's a lot to do there, and it would be really cool to try out techniques for kind of showing the text in a way that would be more beneficial for people's learning curves. Yeah.
Thank you.
One more?
Hi. Granted, it's a pretty small sample size, but would you say that the effect, the identifiability of their first language decreases as their fluency of English increases?
As the fluency what?
Of their English increases.
So
more fluent speakers.
Yeah, that is likely to be the case, but I think with the, as you say, with the sample size that we have, it would be hard to test that reliably. But we're collecting more data, so I think it would be possible to actually test that. My guess is that that would be the outcome, yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, I think let's thank you again.
Right.